I believe I've learned from my successes and my failures. The president I'll look at and say, Mr. President, how'd you do when you were running General Motors as the president, took it over? Gee, you closed down factories, you closed down dealerships. And he'll say, well, I did that to save the business. Same thing with us, Mr. President. This president doesn't know how the economy works. I believe to create jobs, it helps to have created jobs.
All right, the business guy on the stage saying he did it without depending on taxpayer money to do it. Carl Jeffers on that. What do you make of that? There is a distinction. What do you think?
I think there is a distinction, Neil, and I would say this too, that Mitt Romney may be on to something here. The reality is he needs to be running against Barack Obama and not so much Newt Gingrich, even if Gingrich is ahead, or Ron Paul or anyone else. And he's actually better running a presidential campaign as a national race rather than as a primary race. And you know how this came about, Neil? It came about because of the attacks from Newt Gingrich about how when he was chairman of Bain, that they took over companies, broke them up, sold them for profits. And so what Romney is doing is not responding to Newt Gingrich per se, but taking that criticism and shifting it over to Barack Obama and saying he did the same thing. But how did it work out for him? I learned from that, and he hasn't.
Well, that's a good point. See, that's what I read into it. I thought it was what he left out was the fact that I did all this at Bain Capital, as ruthless and cruel as it might seem to people, to save these institutions. The difference being I didn't do it at taxpayers' expense. As we know, with the bailouts of GM and Chrysler, they ended up doing with government rescues what you would have done in Chapter 11. Certainly Chapter 7 bankruptcy anyway, and that is shut down factories, lay off workers so that the greater beast or company, whatever you want to say, can survive. I think that's a very big argument and a compelling one for him to make, and it was odd that Newt Gingrich was presented in the role, maybe post the $10,000 bet thing, to paint that negatively. But that, I think, depending on your point of view, of course, is what is Mitt Romney's biggest selling point.
Well, listen, Neil, I mean, as you know, I'm a Democratic strategist, so I would be looking at how to attack that.
I would have never known, but continue.
I would be, well, I kept that secret just until today, but I would be looking to attack that in the fall. But as a political analyst, what I'm saying is that my evaluation is that this can be a positive approach for Romney, and I think it can actually work, just like Rick Perry, using the Tim Tebow analogy, worked for him last night when nothing else has been working for him in the past. Romney can make an issue of comparing his background and his economic gravitas, if you will, with the president. The factual incorrectness, however, is that unlike General Motors, which was in bankruptcy, which was taken over in order to save the company,
it was not in bankruptcy. GM was not in bankruptcy. GM was not in bankruptcy,
but they were about to file, and they were going under.
They should have done that. That's an important distinction. That's what the whole point of my questioning was, that they should have done that. And they didn't do that. What he is saying is, I did that. Bain Cap, part of what we do is we come in, some of his critics say you just gut companies to save them, but he does save them. He has a 90+% success rate with saving these companies and bring them back to life to save the greater good. And that the difference was GM, wait a minute, just hear me out, I'll let you answer. And that GM could have done that, Chrysler could have done that, and we wouldn't have had to, you know, spend upwards of $60, $70 billion to do what these guys could have done privately on their own. Go ahead.
Well, one point, though, is that the magnitude of the impact of a completely failed General Motors or Chrysler on the national economy was far greater than the magnitude of the companies that Bain was taking over, and that was one of the reasons why the government needed to come in.
A failure is a failure. Bankruptcy is a bankruptcy, and you sort out all your problems in bankruptcy, whether you're doing it with a federally sponsored taxpayer bailout, which was silly, or you do it on your own. Many companies have come back, Continental and so many others.
It is not silly at all to have come to the aid of General Motors, and I will tell you, Neil,
it was stupid to come to the aid of General Motors. It was stupid, and I'll tell you why it was stupid. I'll tell you why it was stupid. No, no one's too big to fail. My point was that they did with taxpayer-sponsored dollars what any private entity would do. They had essentially a bankruptcy filing without a formal filing. They shut down factories. They shuttered plants. They laid off workers. We backed it up as taxpayers. That was the first time that was done. It was weird. It was unprecedented. It was followed up by other such moves, and it set a dangerous motion here where companies feel if they're big enough, and by the way, this goes back to Bush with the banks. I agree with you. It's a bipartisan stupidity. What happened there is then people have a built-in expectation when our fanny's up against the wall, we'll be rescued. I think Mitt Romney is saying, I did that without the expectation the government would.
Right. Well, first of all, let me throw out 3 quick points. One, it's not the first time we did it. We have done it with Chrysler. We did it with U.S. Steel. Number 2, what Romney was doing
nothing approaching this magnitude. Nothing approaching this magnitude.
But that's the point that I made before about the magnitude. That's why the government intervention was necessary. With Bain, they were trying to maximize shareholder value and investor value, not trying to save the company or save jobs. And finally, you talk about the Bush administration.
We ended up losing more jobs at GM and Chrysler through this nefarious taxpayer bailout than we would have seen if they just had an orderly restructuring and bankruptcy. All Mitt Romney is saying, whether you think the argument is compelling or not, all Mitt Romney was saying last night was, look, I did this on my own with a company, Bain Capital. We came in, we fixed a lot of these companies up. Our track record is more superior to what we've seen out of anything Washington has done, and that can be a very compelling argument in the fall should he become the nominee.
And I acknowledge that, but remember what Newt Gingrich was saying, though, would be the counter to your argument, which was that was not essentially the purpose. What they were doing was shutting down plants and essentially putting people out of work. And so what Romney is saying
shut down plants and put people out of work. What the president did, shut down plants and put them out of work. If you're telling me that the rescue,
millions of jobs.
Look, I lived through this time. I covered it. If you're telling me that the rescue at the time, as it was sold, is we want to avoid we want to avoid people losing their jobs. Tens of thousands end up losing them anyway. So we went through all this heartache and trouble, and we still ended up losing a lot of jobs. We could have saved taxpayers a lot of money, let the companies fend for themselves in bankruptcy, as so many other companies have done, and save ourselves this point. That was what Mitt Romney was saying.
Well, but when you consider all of the other ramifications, including the health care benefits, including the union contracts, the impact of a completely failed General Motors would have been far too serious.
Carl,
and
you
I'm
are
telling
lucky.
You, Neil,
you are lucky it's the holiday season and that I love you. Because otherwise now I would have indigestion. Anyway.
But the indigestion comes during the holiday season, too, because you're eating a lot, and you're eating a lot, and I'm having to eat a lot of crow with what I'm hearing here today, Neil, because there are, in fact, 2 big-to-fail entities in the U.S.
Well, I have no idea. Now I have no idea what you're saying, and you're affecting my appetite. But Carl, seriously, it's good seeing you again. Thank you very much. The Republican candidates all send their best. Carl Jeffers in
Romney should, because he's the one I'm endorsing.
Cuckoo, all right, that could be his death knell there. All right, Carl, thank you very much. In the meantime.